In this video, I am discussing why Joel made the correct decision in rescuing Ellie from the Fireflies in The Last of Us Part 1. After watching other reviews on this subject, some of which are really good, I noticed that all of them omit key premises that need to be considered when analyzing the ethics involved with Joel's choice. Notably, each of the many reviews that I have watched make the same mistake that the Fireflies in the game did. They don't think about Ellie herself. Any ethical discussion that omits consideration of Ellie and her lived experiences cannot be considered complete. To share a little bit about my background and qualifications, I have a Master's of Integrated Studies focused on equity theory and cultural theory, which basically involves the study of ethics, equity, as in equality and rights, intersectionality, meaning-making, and social organizing, as well as how various cultural or social groups devise their concepts of ethics and equality based on their methods and symbols of meaning-making. As part of my undergraduate degree, I studied ethics and philosophy, including biomedical ethics, and ethics related to business, government, propaganda, and social organizing. I also studied psychology, with a focus on neuropsychology and trauma. Part of my graduate studies focused on grief and trauma in cultural groups after large-scale traumatic events such as pandemics, war, and genocide. I've also played both games multiple times and watched the series of The Last of Us. And with that, let's get on to the discussion. Ellie isn't old enough to consent. Ellie is 14 years old in The Last of Us, which is not old enough to consent to life-ending or life-altering medical or other procedures. Ethically, Ellie cannot consent to give up her life so that others can try to create a vaccine. Remember that the Fireflies don't have any guarantee that murdering Ellie will result in a successful vaccine. But even if they were able to guarantee that a vaccine could be developed from killing Ellie, Ellie is still too young to consent. The Fireflies lie to Ellie about the procedure, thereby preventing informed consent. Even if Ellie were old enough to consent to dying for the sake of creating a vaccine, she still couldn't provide informed consent because the Fireflies lie to her to hide the fact that Ellie will die from the procedure. The Fireflies, particularly Marlene and the medical staff involved with the procedure, lie to Ellie extensively about the process of creating a vaccine and the slim likelihood that the creation of a vaccine and its eventual distribution will be a success. And very importantly, the Fireflies never tell Ellie that creating a vaccine will kill Ellie. Ellie is prepared to undergo extensive, uncomfortable, and even painful testing to develop a vaccine, but is never consulted about dying to create a vaccine. Therefore, in addition to not being old enough to consent to giving up her life to create a vaccine, Ellie is not able to give informed consent to any medical procedures relating to the vaccine, because she has been repeatedly lied to about the process and likely effectiveness of creating a vaccine. Joel, who functions as Ellie's legal guardian, does not consent to the medical procedure and is not given any opportunity to give consent or deny consent through any formal process. Instead, the Fireflies incapacitate Joel so that he can't interfere with them murdering Ellie, and then they again lie to Ellie, telling her that she'll wake up after the surgery, and drug Ellie for the procedure while Joel is still unconscious. The Fireflies' actions prevent any consent from Joel or Ellie. Ellie is traumatized and therefore not able to provide informed consent. Ellie is a traumatized young teenager suffering from PTSD after having recently survived an abduction, unlawful confinement, sexual assault, and attempted murder perpetrated by a pedophile-led cannibalistic cult. To clarify, yes, it does count as sexual assault if a perpetrator attempts to sexually assault someone, even if that someone is successful in fighting off the assault. Ellie is suffering from PTSD when she and Joel reach the Fireflies who want to create a vaccine, and Ellie's post-traumatic symptoms include anxiety, depression, reduced idea of self-worth, altered self-image, and suicidal ideation. Due to the effects of unresolved PTSD, Ellie is unable to give consent to any major medical or otherwise life-altering procedures, and should absolutely not be asked to consent to any life-altering or life-ending procedures, or lied to and murdered. Requirements for informed consent. To provide informed consent in any ethical manner, Ellie would need both therapy to resolve the trauma that informs her PTSD and to experience life for a while with reduced or resolved symptoms of PTSD. In addition to the trauma of the cult-led abduction, assault, and attempted murder, Ellie is suffering from the trauma of having to kill other people to protect Joel, the trauma of the assault on Joel that left him fighting for his life, trauma from the death of Joel's partner Tess, and the trauma of having to kill her best friend and love interest Riley after Riley became infected. Ellie also suffers from a lack of family, being raised instead by Fedra, who has been training her to be a soldier instead of providing a stable and safe childhood environment. The combination of a lack of a safe childhood environment, complicated by multiple traumatic events, are why Ellie thinks she needs to go through with the medical procedures for developing a vaccine, no matter how inconvenient or painful, in order to make her life and the lost lives of the people she's known or encountered mean something. Ellie has lost the knowledge or belief that her life has inherent value. Ellie has internalized survivor's guilt and the idea that her life has no worth or meaning if she is not in service to or sacrificing her well-being for other people. And it's not enough for consent for Ellie to reach the age of 18 years and be informed that creating a vaccine would require her death. Ellie's traumatic and violence-filled life prevents the early age of 18 years, which is considered a young adult in many cultures, from being old enough to consent to being killed in order to create a vaccine. At the very least, Ellie should be protected and given as safe and enriching a life as possible, including extensive education as much as possible, until the age of at least 25 years old, which is around the age when the human brain finishes developing. This process of brain development has been linked to why most murderers, at least in the United States and Canada, are under the age of 25 years old, as impulse control and rational decision-making are impeded before the brain is fully developed. And after the age of 25 years, people tend to make better decisions and act less impulsively, especially in relationship to violence, and in particular violence that comes from poor impulse control, poor emotional attunement or management, a lack of general education and or self-knowledge, self-awareness, and a sense of self-worth, particularly an awareness or sense of self that is rooted in the self and not in presumed expectations from peers or from pressure to maintain a certain social image or reputation. Additionally, if Ellie wants to have children, she should be allowed to reproduce and to raise those children if she wants to, before feeling pressure to sacrifice her life to create a vaccine. There's a probability, due to the way that Ellie's immunity developed, that Ellie's children would also be immune. If Ellie were to bear children, there's an increased probability that Ellie's offspring could help create a vaccine without requiring anyone to sacrifice their life or to have their life sacrificed in the creation of that vaccine. Vaccine distribution, possible or improbable? In addition to how and when it would be ethical to ask Ellie to consider sacrificing her life to create a vaccine, we have to consider whether or not the creation and distribution of a vaccine is even realistic. In the show, and as echoed by the makers discussing the show, the premise is that Ellie is immune because she is infected with a small amount of her mother's infected blood at the moment of birth before the umbilical cord can be cut. However, if you watch the show closely, you see that not only is Ellie's mother bit before the umbilical cord is cut, and in fact during the process of Ellie's actual birth, but also that Ellie's mother uses the same knife that she used to kill the infected that attacked her while she's giving birth to cut the umbilical cord, presenting a second potential avenue of cordyceps infection to baby Ellie. In either case, regardless of which route led to Ellie's being infected, the result is that Ellie is infected with cordyceps at birth, and the fungus grows with Ellie as she develops into a teenager. In the game, we learn 4 important points about Ellie's cordyceps infection. One is that the infection has taken over most of her brain by the time Ellie reaches the Fireflies at the hospital where they intend to create the vaccine. And another is that the infection Ellie has tells other cordyceps when Ellie is bitten by infected that the host is already infected, which is why no infection develops after Ellie is bitten because she is already infected. The third thing we learn is that for some reason the infection has spared Ellie's temporal lobe, which is why Ellie has not lost her personality or become overtaken by aggressive violence despite being infected. The fourth thing we learn is that the doctors cannot guarantee that the infection that is keeping Ellie immune will stay limited to the areas of her brain that it already covers, meaning that one day the fungal infection that is living on Ellie's brain may take over, causing Ellie to turn into a full-blown infected. This last piece is important because it means that any vaccine created from Ellie's brain tissue will most likely be successful by giving other people a similar infection, an infection that will prevent people from losing their minds, but that will still be a cordyceps infection that may one day turn into full-blown cordyceps, taking over their entire brains and turning them into an infected. There's no way to predict with any certainty if a vaccine developed from the fungus on Ellie's brain would colonize other people in the same way or in a less harmful way than the fungus on Ellie's brain. Which ultimately means that the doctors don't know if, 1, they can create a vaccine, and 2, if that vaccine would actually prevent people from becoming infected over the long term, meaning that giving the vaccine to people would essentially be infecting them with a form of cordyceps and just hoping that the infection never takes over their entire brains. In The Last of Us 1, when you're playing as Joel going through the notes in the hospital while they're about to kill Ellie to make the vaccine, you do get the impression that the doctors working for the Fireflies have tried to make vaccines from other people who were infected or who were resistant to full-blown cordyceps through other mutations of the infection, but that the doctors were unsuccessful in each attempt. You also get some information that suggests that other people who managed not to turn right away in the normal timeline of a few hours to a few days after infection did eventually succumb to the cordyceps infection, if they weren't outright killed by the medical experiments in the Fireflies' attempts to create a vaccine. This means that so far, the Fireflies don't actually have a proven method of creating a vaccine from any extracted tissues, and therefore, there is no guarantee that extracting Ellie's brain matter, killing Ellie in the process, would result in any effective vaccine whatsoever. The Fireflies are basically gambling on a concept that a vaccine might be possible, but lack any scientific evidence that using Ellie's brain matter will be any more successful than the experiments they've tried previously on others. Experiments that leave the subject dead in each attempt. Add to this that the Fireflies' hospital and territory is still under threat from infected and from other survivor groups, and that the Fireflies are severely lacking in the facilities and equipment needed to make and test a vaccine, and it becomes very obvious that Joel is being asked to sacrifice Ellie's life for a very small chance of success in creating a vaccine, and that the vaccine created may in fact at best prolong death from cordyceps infection, but not actually be able to prevent cordyceps infection or to prevent death from cordyceps infection. Even if the Fireflies did manage to make a vaccine from Ellie's brain tissue, whether it was a vaccine that infected everyone with cordyceps or a vaccine that managed to prevent cordyceps infection, there's still the issues of testing the vaccine, of producing enough vaccine to distribute widely, and of rolling out that distribution to every survivor in every part of the world. Even just focusing on the United States, where the game is set, it is highly unlikely that the Fireflies would be able to produce enough vaccine to give to all current survivors. And it is also unlikely that the Fireflies would be able to circulate that vaccine or have survivors come to them in order to receive the vaccine. At the time the first game occurs, it's about 20 years after the onset of the cordyceps pandemic, and most people aren't encountering the infected unless they are leaving settlements that exist as safe zones for the continuation of various forms of society. In many ways throughout both games, the infected are not as much of a threat to everyday life as other human beings are, and we experience this intensely as Joel and Ellie travel to the hospital where the Fireflies are trying to create a vaccine. When Joel and Ellie finally reach the Fireflies, Marlene in both the game and the show comments to Joel how the Fireflies travel in large, heavily armed and fortified groups and still have difficulty surviving, ultimately losing many lives trying to get from one safe zone to another. This makes it very unlikely that the average person would be able to travel to the Fireflies to receive a vaccine, and it means that it is also likely to be very difficult for the Fireflies to successfully travel to the various safe zones to distribute the vaccine. In addition to production and distribution constraints, there is also the large amount of mistrust and power struggles happening between the Fireflies and Fedra and between the Fireflies and everyone else, including the WLF or Washington Liberation Front and the Scars or the Seraphites as they call themselves that we meet in the second game. This friction between survivor groups makes it unlikely that anyone would trust a vaccine offered by the Fireflies, or that the Fireflies would be able to successfully distribute a vaccine to multiple groups. In the world of The Last of Us, survivor groups often kill outsiders on site for various reasons, whether from ongoing animosity, or wanting to take their supplies, or wanting to use them as food or slaves or other problematic intentions. If the Fireflies can't make a vaccine, then they're killing Ellie for no benefit. If the Fireflies can't distribute a vaccine, then they're killing Ellie to create protection only for themselves. There is a significant difference between killing someone who is infected with a deadly virus in order to save an entire population, as was the premise behind the original quarantine zone set up at the beginning of the first game, and killing someone so that other people might have a shot at avoiding becoming ill when doing dangerous things. Another thing we must consider is, what, if anything, would a successful vaccine change? Other than preventing death, trade is the most obvious benefit of a vaccine. A vaccine would mean that survivor groups could try to farm in new areas or participate in trade to improve resource availability. The way groups are at odds in the games makes it very unlikely that trade would happen between opposing groups, but Fedra trade posts might gain the ability to trade with one another. However, a vaccine would not reduce the number of infected that are already everywhere else, and a vaccine cannot reclaim land damaged by bombings. Much of the unusable or dangerous territory in the games is not salvageable because it was previously developed and has become too risky to inhabit and too big of a job to fix given the limited resources that survivors are living on. At best, it's the open territory that can be reclaimed, such as what Tommy's group was accomplishing by creating a new town in a remote area that can be farmed and that can be walled against the infected. The games show us that even the infected have limited lifespans, going through a variety of mutations that eventually end up returning to the Earth, and at most creating pockets of spores in enclosed spaces, such as abandoned buildings. Even the dangerous mutations like clickers, stalkers, shamblers, and so on are created from living tissue that will eventually decay. If survivor groups can limit their contact with the infected by staying out of the danger zones, then it's possible that in a few more decades, the infected will cease being an immediate threat, so long as people stay out of old buildings and dark cave-like places, and so long as they don't return to storing grains the way that the old society used to. In that case, the vaccine is only helpful in the temporary, and for reasons discussed in the previous section, may actually be more harmful to the human race long-term by effectively infecting everyone with some version of the fungus. Well, it's easy to get wrapped up in the concept of whether it's okay to sacrifice the one for the many when discussing the ethics of the Fireflies murdering Ellie in hopes of creating a vaccine, or to contort the concept of doing the least harm to achieve the greatest good when discussing how the Fireflies lie to Ellie about the process of making a vaccine and how they will need to murder her to even make the attempt at creating a vaccine, or to focus on how human survival instincts make it easier to sacrifice strangers over your own loved ones, or how that creates cycles of loss and revenge, such discussions are incomplete if they don't take into consideration Ellie's lived experiences and how our choices impact the world we are attempting to create. Murdering Ellie to attempt to create a vaccine is unethical on every level. And even though Ellie in The Last of Us 2 expresses a willingness to sacrifice her life so that someone can attempt to make a vaccine, there's still an ethical and an unethical approach to allowing Ellie to make and follow through with that decision. The only ethical approach is to wait until Ellie is older and has recovered from her PTSD and lived as good a life as possible before asking her to consider sacrificing her life or allowing her to make such a decision. And therefore, Joel was correct in rescuing Ellie from being murdered by the Fireflies. If you liked this video and want to hear more discussions on ethics related to popular culture or current events, or if you want to share your thoughts on Joel's choice to rescue Ellie, leave a comment below. If you feel like it, like and subscribe. Thanks for listening, and remember to tune in, spud out, and game on.